Om Gyanatimirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Sivasati Gaur Bhaktavinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. I've been asked to speak on a topic that might seem not directly Krishna conscious, and some would say, well, what bearing could it have upon our Krishna conscious society? You see, sometimes by taking a look at other cultures, other spiritual cultures, other spiritual missions, we can get insights, valuable insights, into our own ISKCON situation. We're gathered here this weekend to discuss Varnasrama Dharma. And certainly, the concept of Varnasrama Dharma can seem very exotic and, while worthy of our veneration and respect, it can seem quite idiosyncratic, dinosaur-like, unwieldy. We can think that how could we ever apply such a system that is so contrary to everything that is championed in Western society in terms of values, in terms of lifestyle. We could think that, first of all, just the Hare Krishna movement as we know it is exotic enough. The dress, the Sanskrit and Bengali, so much of the external appearances can seem, even to our own members, as overwhelming and a barrier for newcomers to cross. Then add into the mix Varnasrama Dharma, dividing society into occupational orders and social orders. Oh my God. How does this affect the Communications and Public Relations Department? How are we ever going to be able to justify this? In other words, we're already strange, and now we're going to become even stranger by implanting such an alien system in the Western world. Because Gita Nagari is located in an area with many Amish, I took an interest in the Amish and their ways, their culture, their setup. And shockingly, although we have differences with them, certainly, shockingly, I see an extraordinary example of how a spiritual culture or enterprise, as you might call it, so different from the USA, is thriving, despite all predictions of impossibility. I propose to you that this presentation of the Amish will help in seeing that, indeed, a different lifestyle can survive and even thrive in North America. And even people can come to appreciate it, though they may not want to participate in it in mass, yet they could have some appreciation for the demonstration of a social system that works. In other words, there is some hope for applying Varnasrama Dharma. I'm going to read from notes about the Amish because, it's not my main meditation in life. If I were speaking from Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhagavad Gita, or Chaitanya Charitamrita, that's one thing. But I choose not to have all the facts and figures and concepts of Amish life on my mind day in and day out. But simply for the sake of this Varnasrama conference, I've looked through my notes and gathered some extracts that I think would be valuable in our understanding how a very different social setup can survive in North America. Within, so to speak, the belly of North America is this exotic substratum or subgroup. All right, a brief overview. The issue that fascinates people. How is it and why have the Amish an obviously and insistently, even stubbornly separatist and communal culture? How has that flourished within the USA, one of the most open and individualistic societies on earth? How did the Amish make it in public perception from being stupid, backward bumpkins to media icons and a huge tourist draw? What's going on? Why are Americans so fascinated with such people that seem trapped in the 1800s in terms of how they live, how they dress, how they talk, and especially in terms of their relationship with technology? Let's look at their history very briefly. They started in Europe, Switzerland, Germany, the Netherlands, in the 1500s, and they migrated to the USA in the 1700s, 1800s. By the way, there are none left in Europe now. In the year 1900, there were just a few thousand Amish. Everyone predicted they'll die out because of their antiquated ways. Now, there are approximately 300,000. Every generation, their population doubles. So what happened? Where do they get their growth from? It's not from recruiting in the outside. It's very rare that someone from the outside will join the Amish world. Their growth comes from stable and large families. Having children ranging from 5 to 10. And then not simply having large families, but an 85% minimum youth retention rate. The youth voluntarily choose when they're around 20 years old whether they're going to continue in the way of their ancestors or go freestyle. And it's amazing that in such a apparently antiquated group, so out of step with the American mainstream, minimum 85%, sometimes ranging, some calculations range to 93% of their youth voluntarily choose to take vows to continue in the Amish way for the rest of their life. Farming. The general conception is that the Amish are all farmers. That's not true anymore because of the high price of farmland and it's not that there's unlimited supply of land, so they've ventured into other work activities. But as a whole, the Amish are a rural people. That is a given. Right now, only about 30% of Amish households depend on farming for their primary income. What else do they do? Small businesses, anything from manufacturing to construction. Most of those small businesses that they operate, they own. Some of the construction at Gita Nagari, for example, is done by Amish. And their dharma forbids them from charging more than what they think the job is ethically worth. So you can understand that Dhruva Maharaj Das and Parijata Devi Dasi are very eager to tap into that ethic because they'll get a quality job done for a very honest price. Are their businesses successful? There are some 12,000 Amish businesses across North America. Despite the famous Amish limitation on technology, generally these businesses are successful because, first of all, they have a huge family system to depend on, and they have a distinctive brand identity, niche market. Anything Amish has a kind of marketing mystique to it. Some businesses are generating several $1 million a year. What about their school system? Until around 1950 or so, the Amish attended rural public schools. Then, in the countryside of the USA, came a massive school consolidation effort. And therefore the Amish resisted to the extent that they developed their own one-room schoolhouses. They have about 2,000 such schools with Amish teachers, and their children are educated just up through the 8th grade. The Amish schools focus on reading and writing in English and basic arithmetic. Their children don't attend high school or college. But bear in mind again, Their businesses are generally successful, even to the extent of several $1 million a year revenue. A common misconception is that the Amish suffer from technophobia. This is a gross misrepresentation. All Amish groups regulate various types of technology. What's common to almost all of them is no television, no internet access in schools or home, and no ownership of motor vehicles. They selectively use technology. The principle that guides them is avoiding technology that threatens the welfare of their families or community, and avoiding technology that promotes individual autonomy at the expense of the family and the community. The regulations on technology will vary from Amish group to Amish group. We'll talk about that later. They're like a decentralized Namhutta scene. What's their family life? It's what social scientists call soft patriarchy. The men represent the household to the outside world. However, within the family context, the women are very powerful. One aspect of family life that has been exaggerated by the media is when the children become 16, they're allowed to go experience the outside world, supposedly running wild. And then after immersing themselves in the outside world, they can make a choice. Do they want to become a part of the Amish life or not? If they choose to take part, they take their vows, their initiation vows, so to speak. The exaggeration is that most of them run wild for some years. Drugs and other Kali Yuga activities, and then they some or other snap out of it and become part of the 85 to 93% youth retention rate. But no, the reality is that a small amount only go through the extreme experimentation phase. Most of the kids stick to their home life and their community life and make up their minds to take their vows as they make up their minds from within the community, not from without. We've already discussed how there are about 300,000 Amish as compared to 6,000 at the beginning of the 20th century. Half of that amount is under 18 years of age. So when you have half of your group under 18 and you have an 85 to 93% retention rate, the future does look good for survival. Where do they live? 31 states and Ontario, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. But most of them, about 2/3, live in 3 states: Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Indiana. They have what we might consider Namhut groups, clusters of about 20 families. And they form what's called a church district. Then those church districts, those clusters of 20 to 40 families, can sometimes informally non-ecclesiastically be part of what's called a church settlement, which has one or more districts. Large settlements have more than 100 districts. So they're about, in the Amish world, they're about 2,200 church districts and 509 different settlements. But we'll get into their social organization of their various groups later, because it's decentralized completely. Some of this information I'll be repeating because I didn't want to spend so much time collating it all, but the repetition will be from different angles. About 90% of the Amish attend one or two room private Amish schools. The other 10% go to rural public schools. Only up to the 8th grade though. They have a special government exemption. We may talk about that later. What language do the Amish speak? Regardless of where in North America they live, they speak a Pennsylvania German dialect, popularly known as Pennsylvania Dutch, but it's actually a German dialect. Amongst themselves, they speak that, but however, in dealing with the outside world, they speak English, and their schools teach English. Are the Amish just one group, or are there many different types? There are many different affiliations with varying dresses, buggies, occupations, and rules about technology. The enormous cultural diversity amongst them makes it very difficult to generalize about the Amish. Perhaps, as it is now, very difficult to generalize about the Hare Krishnas. One major difference between us and them is that the Amish are an ethno-religious group, whereas ISKCON has so many different types of nationalities, ethnicities, ages. Do the different Amish groups have anything in common? They share certain practices. Use of horse and buggy for local transportation, rejection of electricity that comes from public utility lines, prohibitions against televisions and computers, and they all wear some type of distinctive old-fashioned dress, beards for the men. They all end formal education at the 8th grade, and they meet in homes for worship every other Sunday. There are no formal religious buildings. And they have lay religious teachers. Their religious teachers have no theological training. And finally, yes, still, they live in rural areas. We discussed about technology. That is a very important point. They modify technology to fit their cultural values. Their elders, their church district elders, meet and discuss if we adopt this technology or not, whether old or new. How will it affect our family life, our community bonds? If you're driving around in Pennsylvania, Ohio, or Indiana, in certain sections of those states, you'll come across the Amish in their horse and buggies on the road. So why? Why horse and buggies? What's the big deal? You see, the Amish think that private ownership of cars would totally destroy their communities. People would drive away from home more often, and also the youth would have easy access to the cities. So basically, they fear the car will pull their communities apart. Also, by using horse and buggy, it shows their separation from the world. They have a basic Christian theology emphasizing the Sermon on the Mount and the Lord's Prayer. I guess you might say it's like us if we just simply emphasize the Shikshashtaka prayers without the enormous Bhagavat philosophy. A prime aspect of their religious outlook is that they're just strangers in this world on their way to heaven. So therefore, why not minimize your interaction with this temporary world, this temporary home? Sounds a little familiar, yes? Minus our Yukta Vairagya principle. Amish-owned shops are becoming quite the norm for them. And most of these shops are small businesses employing fewer than 10 employees. Most of these businesses produce wood products, household and outdoor furniture, gazebos, small barns, and lawn ornaments. Quilt shops, greenhouses, and bakeries have also been successful. Small home-based shops tend to be very profitable. And as I said before, the annual sales of their larger businesses may exceed $5 million. We'll talk about tourism later. But I remember my mother telling me how she paid for a tour of Amish areas in Indiana, because she lives in Michigan. And she was remarking to me, oh, how nice and peaceful it was to see the young Amish girls seated in their craft shop, making various craft items. And then, after the tour was over, we purchased souvenirs in their shop. So I said, Mother, do you realize what's going on from the economic point of view? You paid for a tour to watch these girls produce items which then you proceeded to buy. So they hit you up twice, so to speak. They charge you for the tour, and then as you're watching them make items that they're going to later sell to you, they charge you again for those items. This is economically ingenious. We talked about family size, how it is the large family that propels their population growth. And remember, that population doubles every generation because they have that enviable 85 to 93% youth retention rate. Sometimes members do leave after taking their vows, but generally their communities are models of stability. Divorce is by far the exception. It's quite uncommon. Obviously there'll be smatterings of youth rebellion, drug problems, promiscuity problems, but those are, regardless of what the media hype says, those are by far exceptional cases. Because these things are exceptional cases, therefore the media can hype them up. Amish drug dealer caught. It can be like what the media used to do to us. Hare Krishna's caught doing something criminal. We can value the Amish because they've developed a remarkably stable society. They do not accept government aid because they feel that will ruin their culture of mutual support of their people. So they provide care for their elderly and disabled members. They don't have any homeless or unemployed members and no one living on government subsidies or welfare. Practically no Amish sit in prison. We already talked about how very rarely would an Amish couple seek divorce. So despite their lack of high school education, professional training, and full embrace of technology, they created a very humane, stable society. What do they do for recreation? Their recreation focuses mostly on local activities involving nature. Sometimes the less conservative Amish groups will allow for their hiring a car driven by someone else, a non-Amish, to go visit far-flung relations or visit nature spots. Their main sport, however, what's called the national sport of the Amish, is simply visiting one another. They don't have commercial insurance. Therefore, mutual aid is an all-important feature of their communities. They come together to help members with large hospital bills or other major needs. The famous one being when a barn burns down. The Amish community gets together and puts up a new barn in a few days. What about regulations? All Amish groups expect men and women to wear prescribed clothing. Married men are expected to grow a beard, but not a mustache, and wear an Amish-style hat and vest. Women are expected to wear a head covering and a three-piece dress that usually includes a cape and an apron. In broader American culture, as you know, dress signifies individuality, your personal preferences. Whereas the uniform dress among the Amish shows submission to the collective order and shows a public symbol of group identity. Sounds a little like what Prabhupada had in mind for why we're seen as Hare Krishna people with a distinctive dress. Each Amish community, congregation, negotiates with technology. That means decides how they're going to wrestle with various technological elements. So you'll find the ordinances or regulations governing use of technology will vary from community to community. Although I did mention some regulations that are common to all. A note about their ethics, their values. That's very important because their theology is very simple and plain and unadorned. What's important for them is how they live the Amish way, how their lifestyle should evidence pridelessness, modesty, humility, obedience. I'll read a little here. The Amish have learned to live with limits I could add, that's something that intelligent people throughout the world are wondering about. How can we live on this limited planet with its limited resources, with our unlimited desires? And then, even if the resources were unlimited, even if nature was unlimited, still, in letting loose our unlimited desires, we wouldn't be satisfied anyway. But of course, nature is limited and resources are limited. The problem is our unlimited desires. So in general, the Amish have learned to live with limits. They would argue that setting and respecting limits on almost everything is one of the foundations of wisdom. For the Amish, limits are a requirement for happiness. I should add at this point that social statistics show that the level of depression in Amish communities is rock bottom. Whereas in the rest of North America, depression rates are constantly rising. Moreover, in terms of subjective evaluations of happiness, the Amish score very high. Without limits, the Amish believe, individuals become arrogant, conceited, and self-destructive. To be sure, restraints diminish individual freedom, personal choices, and various forms of self-expression. At the same time, some would say that restraints and limitations grant greater dignity and security to the individual than the endless choices presented by modern life. To the Amish way of thinking, a respect for limits builds community, brings a sense of belonging, and shapes identity. Three important keys to human satisfaction and happiness: building community, sense of belonging, and shaping identity. We've discussed how many outsiders mistakenly think that the Amish reject technology. However, what you should know is that they selectively use technology or modify technology to fit Amish purposes. So they won't hook up to the grid to get their electricity, but they can use batteries. So you might say, well, what's the big deal? But their community elders have analyzed how far they want to go. They want to be the masters of their lifestyle in relation to technology, rather than technology becoming the master of their lifestyle. So they don't consider technology evil in of itself, but they think that if technology left untamed, it will undermine their very worthy and venerable traditions, as they see it, and accelerate assimilation into the surrounding society. Mass media especially would introduce foreign values into their culture. We may talk a bit more about that later, because it's easy to block out TV by not having one in your home, but how do you make sure a smartphone or an iPad doesn't infiltrate your household or cornfield? So many researchers have said that the greatest threat to the Amish is no longer the automobile, it's digital technology. The Amish use batteries to power lights on buggies, calculators, fans, flashlights, cash registers, copy machines, and typewriters. Even they may use solar energy to power these things. This attitude the Amish have towards technology can often puzzle outsiders. Why would God not want us to use a telephone? Why keep a tractor at the barn and not use it in the field instead of plowing horses? Why refuse to own cars but hire non-Amish drivers if you have to go a long distance? What's the difference between taking 12-volt electricity from batteries and 110-volt electricity from public utility lines? These distinctions can look silly to outsiders, but for the Amish, they represent cultural adaptations that help to slow the pace of social change and keep worldliness at bay. And this is a very important point. Slow the pace of social change so that your family bonds, your community bonds are not threatened. The Amish seek to master technology rather than become its slave. Like few other communities, they have shown the tenacity to tackle the powerful forces of technology in order to preserve their traditional way of life. We spoke briefly about how the Amish are more concerned about practicing their faith than teaching formal theological doctrines. They don't have any church buildings. They hold church services in their homes. They rotate every other Sunday. The members of a congregation meet in the home of one of their members. On the other Sunday, when they're not meeting formally at a member's home, they may visit other families, have a Bible reading, or even attend a service in another nearby district. Their worship services ritualize many of the key values of their life and faith. Humility, community, simplicity, and yieldedness to God's will. Core values. Because remember, more important to them than theology is the way of life. Walking the talk. The theology is very simple. An emphasis on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and the Lord's Prayer. The core value of their society focuses upon yielding oneself to higher authority. Whew. Sounds quite bad, doesn't it? And the Amish speak of giving themselves up to the church. They glorify self-surrender, submission, yielding to the will of God and to others, contentment, and a calm spirit. This is not culty in any way. It's simply the opposite of the bold individualism raging in the West that promotes self-interest at every turn in the road. Here is where Amish society most diverges from contemporary culture. The very marked opposition to the ever-increasing individualism, self-promotion, and self-interest that characterizes the Western world. The Amish abhor pride. What is pride to them? Actions and attitudes that beg for attention and recognition. They focus on what they consider humility. So therefore, no showy clothing, wristwatches, fancy drapes in the home, no fancy ornaments on the harnesses of the horses. All that could signal pride. No cosmetics, jewelry, and no personal photographs. All these regulations are designed to prevent personal pride and the emphasis on the individual at the expense of the family and the community. The twin virtues in their communities are humility and obedience. Humility in the way that you have respect for others and respect for elders. Members are taught to obey those with authority over them: children, their parents; students, their wives; students, their teachers; members of a congregation, their congregational leaders. Everyone's expected to obey the will of God as taught by the community. At the same time, social researchers say there is great respect for the dignity of each individual person. So here you see core values that are very much in opposition with mainstream society. Community and tradition play important roles in Amish life. The welfare of the community ranks above individual rights and choices. Communal wisdom accumulated over the decades is valued more than the opinion of one person. Traditional beliefs and practices are esteemed above scientific findings. In fact, generally their schools don't teach science, and actually their schools don't teach religion. The day begins with the Lord's Prayer. Let's talk a bit about the government in relation to the Amish. Once the rural one-room schoolhouses that used to be so common in America became consolidated into large school districts and large schools. That was during the 1940s and 50s. The Amish protested because they wanted to retain control over the nurturing of their children. And they also considered formal study beyond the 8th grade unnecessary for their farming lifestyle. Finally, in 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Amish children could end their formal schooling at the age of 14. They also have exemption from military service, and they have exemption from Social Security. So in this way, they have interacted with the government and come out quite well. Going back to their education, their curriculum includes reading, arithmetic, spelling, grammar, penmanship, history, and some geography. Science and sex education are not usually taught. Reminds me a little bit, of Prabhupada's original instructions on Gurukula, what they should learn. The classroom taught by Amish women, generally the one-room schoolhouse style, teaching several grades at once, emphasizes cooperative activity, obedience, respect, diligence, kindness, and the natural world. And then, at odds with mainstream society, in their school system, very little attention is given to independent thinking and critical analysis. You may wonder, well, what's the outcome of the limited education that they get since they stop at the age of 14? Scholars say that the quality of instruction varies considerably across the different Amish congregations. In some communities, Amish pupils have scored very well on standardized achievement tests. But for the Amish, the real test of their schools is not how they compare in achievement tests with suburban schools, but how well they prepare Amish youth for success in Amish culture. Their schools play an important role in passing on Amish values developing friendships, limiting exposure to the outside world, and preserving Amish culture across the generations. We already said that the Amish are basically an ethno-religious group. They're all of the same ethnicity. And in ISKCON, we are a patchwork quilt of multi-ethnicities. The network of extended families provides a strong sense of identity in Amish society, especially when you have families with 5 to 10 children. That produces a lot of aunts and uncles and cousins and so on and so forth. And the family provides a very dense web of social support from cradle to grave. What happens with the old folks? They normally live in an apartment, in the home of one of their children, or in a small adjacent house. As much as possible, the Amish emphasize separation of church and state. They prefer not to receive any subsidies from the government. They won't serve on any government committees or commissions, but they will consult and cooperate with local officials. They generally avoid holding public office and engaging in political activism. They are allowed to vote, but their rate of voting is usually quite low unless a local issue that affects them is on the ballot. Some Amish communities in some counties, one in Ohio, one county in Ohio and one county in Indiana, have become so abundant with Amish. They predominate so much that they actually can wield, if they want to, political clout because they're the majority. What about their leaders of the congregation? Remember, their congregations are like Nam-Hut groups, totally decentralized though. And those Nam-Hut groups can choose to informally, non-institutionally or ecclesiastically, relate to other groups, in that way form a settlement, which can be from anywhere near 10 groups to 1,000 forming a settlement. For national issues that affect all the Amish in the USA, they do have a national steering committee, but again, it's nothing institutional. It's kind of ad hoc, arising whenever they need to deal with the government on nationwide issues. None of their leaders have any theological training. Their most important credential is how they live a consistent Amish way of life. And they're not paid. A few last points. Amish life is basically caught up with 3 cornerstones. Resistance to the outer world, adaptation to the outer world, and negotiations with the outer world. They're constantly undergoing this. What elements of mainstream society do we resist? What elements do we accept? And what elements do we bargain with, to and fro, negotiating? This is a central dynamic of their life because they're so concerned with their values and how their values will survive. They were thought to have no chance for surviving. As I mentioned in the beginning, the year 1900, there were just 6,000 Amish. Now there are over 300,000. Professors at Yale University in the 1950s told their anthropology students, PhD candidates who wanted to study the Amish, that better get there quick because they have no chance for making it into the future. They're backwards, they're dumb, they're denying all the prime necessities of life. So yeah, go do your PhD on them because they're not going to be around for long. It pays to be different. Yes, the Amish are making heaps of money simply by sticking to their old ways of the 19th century. Some facts. The three largest Amish conglomerations, that is, in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, draw 19 million tourists a year, and those tourists generate more than $2 billion a year. Not bad for being weird, huh? And having a completely different lifestyle and a completely different social system. Most of that money is spent in one county in Pennsylvania, Lancaster County. Most of that, $2 billion a year. As far as employment, I'll give you the employment figures. Overall, in the three largest Amish conglomerations, tourism employs 33,000 persons. In just Lancaster County alone in Pennsylvania, tourism employs 22,000 persons. When you look at the tourist per Amish ratio in the three main areas, the statistics are that for every one Amish living in those areas, there are 235 tourists. There's something about Americans that they want to see a holistic way of life, a stable way of life. In their cultural memory, perhaps you could say, is some longing for a simple way of life, a slowed down, unhurried pace of life. So they're paying to see that. In our studies of Varnasrama Dharma, we may indeed have something to offer to the world when we finally get around to applying it, at least in the rural setting. So I'm offering this information about the Amish simply to show that it's possible to be different and to survive and to thrive. And for those of you who are concerned financially, it's possible to make a lot of money too. Most importantly, though, it's possible to pass on core values from generation to generation. And the individualistic obsession of mainstream Western world is not the only way to be. And this group is demonstrating stability, wholesomeness, family integrity in such an exemplary way, you have to say, that people are willing to pay to see it, and they become, instead of being perceived as negative and dumb and backwards and suffering from technophobia, now they become media icons. All right, thank you very much. Hare Krishna.